Good evening, everybody. You can hear me?
Yes.
And so far you can understand me. Thank you very much for your warm welcome. A particular word of thanks to Professor Ireland, Professor Parker, and Dr. Daly, who have been most kind in facilitating my trip here from Ireland and have been so hospitable, along with so many other members of the department and of the student body, and I'm very, very grateful for that warm reception. Now, I'm going to talk to you tonight for about an hour, I hope it won't be much longer than that, with pictures about this topic, which is the Spanish Inquisition and the foreigner, and it's subtitled A New Angle on the Early Modern Irish in Europe and Further Afield, which is a sort of an angle on the Irish which certainly was new to me up until a year ago. So I'm going to share some of that novelty with you, and I hope it will be at least diverting and perhaps even informative and maybe a little amusing to you as well tonight. Okay? Now, a word on the National University of Ireland in Maynooth, where I teach. There are 3 charming pictures, not entirely unrepresentative of it. The older picture, the watercolour, is from 1799, and it's the front of the college with the medieval castle there to your right, and the original college building, and then 2 other pictures, more modern, one of the Gothic, the Neo-Gothic part, and one of the Georgian part, which are still there, still functioning, and a part of a very, very lovely and attractive university campus. That is the publicity part over now, but you're all very welcome to consider, as Professor Parker said, it is a wonderful opportunity. I went abroad myself when I was about your age, and I never got over it, and I've really appreciated having had that chance, and I think it's one you should seize. Carpe diem, as they used to say. Please seize the chance if you can, seize the day. It is a wonderful opportunity and will change your life for you. Now, why am I interested in this? And where did my interest come from? Well, in 1997, which seems a long time ago to you, but to me isn't really, I got involved in a research project in Maynooth called the Irish in Europe. I was sick and tired of hearing about the Irish in America and the Irish in England. And I was more interested in the Irish in Europe, which is really where the Irish migrated to, because Ireland was always a fairly miserable country and people wanted to get out of it. It's where Irish people went to before America was discovered and became such a welcoming home for us. So I got interested in the Irish in Europe, and there's a large migration of the Irish to Europe over a sustained period, beginning increasingly numerically from about 1580, 1590. Okay, so I set up that project with a few other colleagues, and that's how I got interested in the Irish in Europe. Now, that sort of was a reflection of a new interest in Irish migration, both in Ireland and abroad. Particularly, people were trying to see the roots of Irish migration. Did people only start to migrate when America was discovered, or were there migration patterns before that? And if so, were those patterns related? Okay, so that's basically the interest I had. Now, Maynooth is a good place to do this because there's an enormous archive in Maynooth called the Salamanca Archive, which is the largest Spanish language archive in the British Isles. And it's in Maynooth, and it's the record of all the Irish colleges, a great number of which were set up in Europe, after 1590. And this archive goes all the way to 1950, when General Franco allowed this archive to leave Spain, and it came to Maynooth, and there it's been ever since. I was also involved in a journal called Archivium Hibernicum, which publishes source material even remotely related to the Irish and the Irish diaspora, and there's a large number of Europe-related articles and material in that, which excited my interest. There was a historiographical context. You all know what historiography is. It's the history of history, how people do history and how that changes over time. And I was particularly interested in how people looked at migration in different ways as time moved on, as circumstances changed. And I was also interested in how the treatment of the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, had changed in recent years, from causing a shiver to run up one's spine to becoming a topic of ordinary historical research and interest. So that excited my interest too, especially in Spain. And I also have a wing, an electronic wing, on prosopography, which is a big word for biography. In other words, I'm interested in how you use digital resources in order to facilitate access to large numbers of biographical records. So we have about 50,000 biographical records of Irish people in Spain, and it was a bit of a job to try and get those online, accessible and usable to historians. Okay? Now, I have to start at the beginning. I hope you don't mind if I do. Okay? With misunderstanding the Inquisition, which is what most of us do. Okay? Now, I'm going to mention two Inquisitions tonight, and I'm hardly going to talk about them, and I'm going to concentrate on the third one. Okay? Now, the ones I'm going to mention briefly are the Medieval Inquisition, briefly mentioned. I'm going to mention the Roman Inquisition, briefly mentioned, and I'm going to mention and stick with the Spanish Inquisition. But there are three different phenomena, all right? Now, there is an enormous historiography of the Inquisitions, okay? The Spanish Inquisition was set up in 1480 in Spain, all right? And from the very beginning, it was a controversial organization which endured enormous opposition by very strong vested interests in Spain, okay? And one of the most extraordinary critiques of the Inquisition comes from very early on, from a man called Bartolomé de las Casas. Some of you who do Spanish history may know him. He wrote a searing criticism of the Inquisition in 1542. So the Spanish, please remember, had an inborn facility to criticize the Inquisition. It was a very controversial organization in Spain itself. Naturally, because Spain was Catholic and the Inquisition was an instrument in the eyes of some of Catholicism, it excited enormous interest and hatred in Protestant Europe. And one of the seminal texts was John Fox's Book of Martyrs in 1554, a damning critique of the Inquisition, okay, which colored how you and I, as English speakers, view the Inquisition. Okay, that was sown as an idea, and it persisted through time to our time. Montanus was another one, 1567, and this negative view of the Inquisition was so strong that Spanish scholars at the beginning of the 20th century began to speak of the black legend regarding the Inquisition. And I have the nice Spanish term, la leyenda negra, which is a really modern term from 1912 by Juderías, a Spanish critic and historian. So, a controversial phenomenon, one which was disputed in Spain itself, and one which outside of Spain gave rise to an extremely negative image, an extremely negative opinion of Spain as obscurantist, as priest-ridden, as intolerant, and as a place where human freedom could not survive. Okay, that was a lot to get over. And of course, most of it is not true at all, but that's beside the point. Now, as time went on, the Inquisition evolved and changed. And by the time we come to the Enlightenment, the 18th century, which is a century of light, les Lumières, as the French call it, people are beginning to think rationally, they're beginning to think post-religiously, they're beginning to think even anti-religiously. The Inquisition comes in for criticism too, from a new source. And this is from an officer of the Inquisition himself, a man called Juan Antonio Llorente, who was a very highly placed official in the Spanish Inquisition, left Spain, learned English, and wrote a history of the Inquisition. And because he was writing for his audience, the history he wrote was not altogether flattering. Okay? And that book was translated many years later into Spanish and caused a terrible controversy in Spain. In the 19th century, that negative Enlightenment critique of the Spanish Inquisition continued, and there is a really important Spanish and American connection here. I'll concentrate on the American one because this is a very, very important man. A man called Henry Charles Lee or Lay, I never know how to pronounce his name, maybe you can help me. Naturally enough, he had an Irish mother, but he was 100% American, and he wrote a 4-volume history of the Spanish Inquisition between 1906 and 1908. And every idea you and I have regarding the Spanish Inquisition comes from him. He absolutely dominated how English speakers thought about the Inquisition until very, very recently. Based very much on Llorente and based very much too on De las Casas, John Fox, and his own archival research. Okay? So he's an extraordinarily important character. Now, that really is the history of the Inquisition until very, very recently. Now, what happened recently which changed the way the Inquisition was spoken about and taught about by historians was the death of a dictator. And in 1975, for weal and for woe, El Generalissimo of Spain, General Franco, died. Okay? Spain opened up, and its archives opened up to internal and external examination. And there was enormous renaissance or resurgence in study of the Inquisition. Now, in the beginning, the best people to study the Inquisition were the English and the Americans. Why? Because they had some experience. People like Lay, influenced by people like Llorente and others. And Henry Kamen, for instance, a very well-known historian, English-speaking historian, led the posse into the revitalization of the study of the Spanish Inquisition. 1975, that seems to many of you here a long, long time ago. For me, it doesn't seem that late ago at all, and for others, I'm sure, you remember it as if it was only yesterday. So it's very recent, historiographically. That's not meant to insult anybody at all. It's just meant to be realistic. Okay, so it's not a long time ago. So 1975, an extraordinary new revival and revitalization of the study of the Inquisition. 3 or 4 names you need to know. Kamen. And what did Kamen do? He exploded the Black Legend. The Black Legend isn't good enough. It's not enough to hate the Inquisition. You must understand it. Henry Kamen. Number 2, Netanyahu, who concentrated on the anti-Semitic origin of the Inquisition. Why was the Inquisition anti-Semitic? What did anti-Semitism mean in late 15th century Spain? Very big questions, very important questions. And they began to change how people look at the Inquisition. A man called Didieu, a French scholar, he started doing case studies of the Inquisition. Instead of talking about it globally, he began to look at particular cases. And he looked at Toledo, where there was a particular tribunal of the Inquisition. Contreras did a case study of Santiago. And then the 2 biggies came along. Henningsen, who is a Dane, and Contreras, who is a Spaniard. And what they did was an initial statistical description of 50,000 cases which had been tried before the various tribunals of the Inquisition. This was done in the 80s before information technology became easy to use. A lot of punch cards, a lot of tears, and a lot of frustration. But they came to some extraordinary conclusions. First of all, the Inquisition changed over time. Secondly, only 2% of people who came before the Inquisition were executed. That is way below the execution rate for civil justice at the same time. The Inquisition was bloody and deadly, yes, but not nearly as bloody and deadly as other jurisdictions contemporary at the time. Thirdly, 40% of the people who came before the Inquisition because of heresy, as the Inquisition defined it, because they were accused of backsliding into Judaism or backsliding into Islam. Okay? And remember, friends, the Inquisition has jurisdiction only over Catholics. You must be a backslider. You can't judge a Jew, you can't judge a Muslim. They must be Catholics if they're going to be tried, okay? So 40% of them were backsliding Catholics into Judaism or Islam, but a massive 60%, friends, were Catholics. So the Inquisition went after Catholics. Why? We'll discover that in a little while.